In his analysis of case discussion, C. Roland Christensen from Standard University argues that student involvement develops on at least 3 distinct levels. At level 1, students explore a problem by sorting out relevant facts, developing logical conclusions, and presenting them to fellow students and like an instructor. The student discuss someone else's problem. Their role is that of the observer in the traditional academic sense. At the second level, where the students learn, students can be assigned roles in the case and take on perspectives that require them to argue for a specific actions from a character's point of view, given their interests and knowledge. And finally, on the third level, students will take the initiative to become fully involved so that topics are no longer treated as topics as in abstract ideas, but become central to the students' sense of self, of what they would choose to do in a specific real world situation. It's only after both the sides are set for the real kickoff the discussion pastures can start. It calls for leading the case discussion and evaluating the performance thereafter. In order to start the discussion in class, any instructor can start with an easy, non-controversial question that all students should be able to answer readily. However, some of the best case discussions start by forcing the students to take a stand. Some instructors will ask a student to do a formal opening of the case, outlining his or her entire analysis. Others may choose to guide discussion with questions that move students from problem identification to solutions. A skilled instructor steers the questions and discussions to keep the class on track and moving it at a reasonable pace. Meanwhile, in order to motivate the students to complete the pre-reading before the class, as well as to stimulate attentiveness during the class, the instructor should grade the participation, that is quantitative and more importantly qualitative, during the discussion of the case. This might be as simple as a tick, a plus, a minus or a 0. The instructor should involve as many students as possible. In order to encourage all the students, the instructor can divide them into groups, give each group several minutes to discuss or how to answer a question related to the case, and then ask a randomly selected person in each group to present the group's answer and reasonings thereafter. The random selection can be accomplished through rolling of a dice or shuffled index cards, each with one student's name, or spinning of a wheel. The flow of case discussion may be something like this sequential order: starting a discussion posture, that is framing students' approach to the case by asking for an assessment or diagnosis or recommendation of a course of action. Post which it calls for following up, which means responding to students' comments by probing for more depth. Probing for more depth here is drilling down, or opening up the discussions to more participants, which is moving laterally, or asking for generalizations, which is linking up. Now, it calls for transitioning to the next critical point that needs to be discussed. Now, under the purview of case, bridging. Bridging here means linking the current posture with the next discussion block, which may include checking for student comprehension before moving on. And it goes without saying that inherent need to handle special challenges after the discussion, it's very critical, one critical ball game, which if treated well leads to win-win situations. This may also include responding to student contributions that have the potential to derail the entire discussion, as when a comment is tangential or long-winded, incorrect, confusing, inappropriate or offensive. It needs to be taken care of. The first question in the discussion is really important for setting the right tone for the rest of the discussion. Start with an open-ended inquiry. If you start with a question that is too thick, too formidable, or looks like a trick question, people resent to answer. No one will answer. The best opening questions are open-ended, where there are multiple reasonable answers or where the question is neutral and simple to answer. Quick tip, hold back from engaging in controversial or emotional material until all facts have been established and put into the context. If you start off on a fighting issue, there is a good chance that the facts will get lost in the barrage of attacks and counterattacks. Hence, a basic framework for a case-based discussion can be broken down into 6 steps. Number 1, give students ample time to read and think about the case. If the case is long, assign it as a homework with a set of questions for students to consider and ponder upon. Number 2, introduce the case briefly and provide some guidelines for how to approach it. Clarify how you want students to think about the case. Break down the steps you want students to take in analyzing the case. If you would like students to disregard or focus on a certain information, specify that as well. Number 3, create groups. I have already reiterated creating groups and monitor them to make sure everyone is involved. Small groups can drift off track if you do not provide structure. You may want to designate roles within each group. Alternatively, group members could be assigned broad perspectives to represent or asked to speak for the various stakeholders in the case context. Number 4, have groups present their solutions with adequate reasoning. 5, asks questions for clarification and move the discussion to another level, and then synthesize issues thus raised. Post this extensive discussion, students do look forward for a final conclusion from the instructor, and no case is ever concluded until conducted and concluded by the case provider. There are a few things we need to keep in our minds. As an instructor, try incorporating holistic perspective of all the strategies and ideas that emerged on board. That is, taking note of all the contributions from the right perspective which supports the context and topic we need to emphasize upon. During the case scrutiny, it is really important to assess the organization's potential opportunities and threats, both internally and externally. The prospective solutions offered need to be practicable, and there is an obvious need to determine whether goals, objectives, strategies and policies are realistic in light of the prevailing constraints cited in the case. Therefore, the applicability of the solution needs to be looked into specifically. The protagonist needs to evaluate the firm's competitive position. Hence, the conclusion must incorporate firm's comparative standing within the industry and establishment of a hard-nosed perspective of each problem issue and indicate problem linkages and interrelationship. It's a must for an apt conclusion. Remember, there is no right or wrong answer. It is just a situation. Thus, the need to conclude the case with an all-inclusive solution is a must. Once the case discussion is concluded and the case engagement ends, as the process instructors, we really need to look back and introspect for right future endeavors. We need to ask ourselves a few questions like, was I well prepared? Was I confident? Excited about the class? Did I set high standards in the class discussion? Now, high standards here is It is regarded as the right context setting and outcomes you wish to achieve, right? Now, did I listen thoughtfully to the student comments and treat students with empathy and respect? How effectively was my discussion leaders, and whether it resulted in student discovering, articulating and developing the most critical analysis and insights during the class? Or how effectively did I manage the discussion flow while responding flexibly to both individual comments and section dynamics? And one most important aspect here is to effectively use the boards and classroom technology to support the learning process. One key point is that we can instantly ask the students about how they feel about the class and what more in terms of value addition do they expect from us, so that it is thoughtfully incorporated in future classes, and it also gives them a feeling of being the center of the entire discussion and they being the only stakeholders of the outcome of this class. And this introspection can also be done from students' perspective in order to have a better participation in upcoming classes. As in how well prepared were the students? Did they participate and listen actively throughout? Were they there in the discussion? And to what extent did students contribute to ideas, analysis and personal experiences instead of simply presenting case facts? And one important aspect is to rate students' participation in the case class. That is, did students really build effectively on each other's comments? We have to look into that. We also have to introspect about the overall setup, which is nothing but feedbacks for future improvements. It could be in areas like which aspect of the class sessions were particularly inspiring, or where do the students derail from the real argument and raise concerns, where the principal learning objectives achieved. Did in-class learning substantially exceed pre-class learning? And most importantly, were students stimulated to think beyond the class and develop insights through linkages across classes, modules and courses? Were they able to reorient themselves to this ever-evolved learning pedagogy? Therefore, just to sum it up, there are few preconditions that needs to be fulfilled in order to achieve the right goal of everlasting learning process, which is number one, there must be mutual respect between the instructor and that of among the students. Instructors and students come to a class well prepared. Instructor and students apply rigorous standards and are willing to take risks and consider different point of view as a common discussion. The case supporting materials, assignment questions and teaching plan are well designed and are part of an effective module and course structure. Beyond discussion and small group work, there are a number of classroom activities or techniques that can be used to enhance case methodology. Number one, role play. Now, as I already told you, when picking students for role play, try to consider their backgrounds and pick students who either fully identify with the role or are on the exact opposite end of the spectrum. Pick students who have participated before, as they will be likely to enliven the discussion. And finally, pick students across the room from each other so that their dialogue amongst one another remains. A very important technique is take a vote. Now, a vote requires students to publicly commit to their positions, engaging them with the discussion and making them more likely to argue for their side. It will also give you a sense of where the class stands on the debate. If the vast majority of the class stands on one side, you will know to back up the minority so they don't feel overwhelmed and stop participating or shutting down forever. Don't let the debate get over. Another way is having students write their own case studies. In order to construct a plausible case study, they'll research facts, consider various angles of an issue, and have greater engagement in the course. It's really powerful. We can also do it by the way of dividing the case into sections. We can break the students into group and divide the case into sections and assign each group a different aspect or section of the study. Have them present their findings to the other groups. Remind students that they do not have all the information they need to solve the case, but based on the information available, they can make recommendations and come to preliminary decisions, something that they have to do in the real world as well, and they will have to be able to do in real business situations. One more important idea here is the idea of parking lots or message boards. Have the students continue the discussion on a message board within the blackboard or on a class blog or using Twitter. This will give them the room to reflect on their positions and allow you to track their discussions over time. Now, after this procedural discussion on how to deal with cases, let's take a case in point and reflect what we understood from the discussion. Please listen to the case narrative very carefully to better resonate with the case setup. Now, this is a typical case of the concept of mass production in the rule of general management. And the real advocate of mass production was Mr. Henry Ford. Now, let's get to know more about Mr. Ford. Son of a poor Irish immigrant, Ford was born in 1863 and grew up on a farm in the rural Michigan. He was fascinated by the machinery and was quite skilled in repairing and improving almost any machine. He started the Ford Motor Company in 1903 and by 1908 the Model T was built. In the part of the century when automobiles were introduced, they were a symbol of status and wealth, and it was a near exclusive province of the rich only. Ford intended to change that. The Model T was to be for the masses, a car that virtually anyone could afford. He understood that the only way to make such a car possible is to produce it at a high volume and low cost. Ford focused his factory efforts on efficiency, mechanizing wherever possible, and breaking down tasks into their smallest components. One worker would perform the same task over and over, producing not a finished part, but one of the operations necessary for the production of the whole. The incomplete part produced by one would then be passed to another worker who would contribute to a successive operation. Understanding the liability, Ford was able to achieve remarkable efficiencies. Although the first Model T took 12.5 hours to be produced, only 12 years later in 1920, Ford was producing one Model T every minute. By 1925, at the peak of the car's popularity, a Model T was rolling off Ford's assembly lines at the rate of one every 5 seconds. Henry Ford and the Model T have long been symbols of industrial age. Even the following growth and success of Ford's rival, General Motors, was due in large part to General Motors' need to find an innovative response to the Model T. In large measures, the managerial approach of Henry Ford as well as his preferences in the managerial theory. Now, listening to this situation, I hope we all will be able to understand the idea of how the concept of mass production came into being. Now, however, mechanization of this plant had many adverse effects. The faster Ford pushed his workers, the more disgruntled they became. In 1913, turnover was 380% and Ford had to hire 10 times more workers than he needed just to keep his line moving. In an action that was unprecedented back at that time, Ford simply decided to double the wages in order to get best people and motivate them to work even harder. In the days following the announcement that wages were being doubled, thousands and thousands of men came into the Ford plant in search of work. And of course, police had to be called to control the crowd. Unfortunately, Ford died in 1945, leaving a wealth worth over $600 million. He left an inedible mark on both American industry and society. His name is synonymous with mass production and the development of modern management theory. Most people associate Henry Ford with Model T, the affordable mass-produced automobile that changed the society. But Ford is also important as a management thinker because not only he developed ideas about how organizations must function, Ford also hired theorists such as Frederick Winslow Taylor, father of scientific management, and gave them the chance to develop their management theories. Ford has been criticized for not using his approach as a way to learn about better ways to run his company. While Ford was giving his customers no choice about anything other than the price, which was attractive back then, Alfred Sloan was transforming General Motors big time. Beginning in the 1920s, Sloan rejected part of Ford's theory about running a business in favor of alternative ways to design automobiles and organize manufacturing and distribution. General Motors' marketing strategy had always been to market nationwide with cars of interest to different segments of people. Sloan set up separate divisions with central direction from headquarters to market big Oldsmobile, Pontiac, Cadillac and Chevrolet lines. In contrast to Ford, each type of car had its own distinction and price differentials. Remember, Model T was the only model available. Now, after this narrative, look into specific case ask. Imagine that you are a manager in one of the Ford plants in the early 20th century. Your factory employs thousands of workers. This is a scale of enterprise unprecedented in the Western history. Many of your employees were raised in agricultural communities and industrial routines are new to them. Many of your employees as well as are immigrants from other lands. They do not speak English well, if at all. As a manager under these circumstances, you'll probably be very curious about how you can develop a working relationship with these people. Your managerial effectiveness depends on how well you understand what it is that is important to these people, your workforce. Now, this is a typical elaborate case where in the concept of mass production, assembly line production, specialization, division of labor is highlighted. However, few base problems that are brought forth like resentful employees, employee turnover, higher salaries to retain that specialized workforce. This brings forth the problem itself and the discussion of this case. This being a teaching case is a rich narrative which contains information and is inviting analysis and thus solution as a manager. Now, if we follow the procedure that we set forth in the entire discussion beforehand, it follows a 4-step procedure. Choosing the right case. So, as an instructor, I chose to discuss this case because I wish to bring forth the conceptual clarity on the notion of classical theory of management. That is, with emphasizing on the concepts of enhancing workers' productivity. Second, how must a teacher prepare for this case class? Now, it may include readings, lot of reading of the available texts about classical theory, specifically theories that focused on resolving workers' output and thus their efficiency and industrial output enhancement, thereby reaching the economies. Exploring other examples similar to Ford Motors that speak of mass production and workers' productivity, and of course structuring in mind the right board plan. So, as to easily put forth relevant aspects of the mentioned case in the relevant spaces for the students to rightly articulate. Now, the third in the process is students. How must students prepare for the above case? Remember, a lot of pre-planning goes into which and how you want to introduce the case in the class. Therefore, it's a prerequisite to generate interest in the minds of the prospective participants much in advance. As in, you can ask them to read about Henry Ford or General Motors and Henry Ford's way and styles of management that brought forth a path-breaking automobile model, Model T. Next in line is kicking off to a discussion. You can narrate the case as right narratives are of absolute importance to set the context. It requires to ascertain a few key pointers like defining the issues, analyzing the case data, generating alternatives, or analyzing and evaluating alternatives and selecting the preferred alternatives. Post which discussion on developing an action implementation plan is very well required. So, in order to conclude, although case studies are not a new teaching method, they are a method that can be useful, providing an opportunity for students to think outside the box. Through the use of case studies, students can actively engage in applying learned concepts, objectives, and knowledge to hypothetical situations by using critical and higher order thinking skills to answer tough questions. We can use elaborate case studies like sudden fall in share prices resulting from the random news of the founder of the company being missing. You are the public relation officer of the company. How will you handle media and other stakeholders? A standard elaborate case. Or it can be one or two-liner case studies. It may simply look like write a marketing pitch for a hair growth serum company, especially targeting people with hair problems. Or another way is videos or news excerpt case studies, where the case ask can be, please view the assigned videos, and as you watch them, keep in mind what you have learned about the non-financial employee motivation techniques. The above mentioned examples are of scenario-based story that focuses on a specific hypothetical problem which needs supporting literature that aligns with the main theme of the story and guiding questions that help the learner gain the most from understanding the concepts and objectives of the case study by applying critical and higher order thinking skills. In the beginning, students may be unfamiliar with the case method or may be predisposed to distrust the group work. They need to know exactly what is expected of them in order to be successful in the class. To avoid causing frustration, here are a few top tips. Start with a simple case first and then discuss the purpose and suggested methods for doing a case assignment. If cases are done in a team, introduce students to resources for team dynamics. Allow sufficient class time for students to meet with their teams and their team members. Establish discussion etiquettes and guidelines. What is the decorum? Take sufficient time to introduce the narrative and establish the case facts, the right fundamentals. Reassure students that messiness is normal for this type of assignment. Make sure you give students an opportunity to provide their reactions and feedback. So in the end, let's quickly summarize what we started of our discussion. We started off our discussion with the real need to use case methodology as one of the most effective teaching techniques. We also covered that how should a teacher prepare for an effective case class and how should students be groomed for this case classes to be of real worth. We also discussed a working case and the right way to handle the case and its analysis to successfully establish right logics and underlying theoretical concepts. Hope you all had an enriching session. Thank you.